Well, now, once upon a time, little Orley was out helping his pa cut cabbages to send to market. And Orley, he says,
I wish there was a little green cabbage worm so's I wouldn't have to work.
Do you really mean that?
Says a strange voice.
I sure do,
Says Orley.
Very well, then,
Says the voice.
Orley, be a cabbage worm.
And all of a sudden he was. A little green cabbage worm with about 24 feet in legs a-setting on a head of cabbage. Before he knew what was happening, someone cut the cabbage and threw it in a crate, and cabbage, crate, and Orley and all was on a train, headed for market. Well, sir, it chugged along for quite a spell, and finally it stopped by a big river, and some men unloaded the crates and put them on a big barge, and a little tugboat started pushing them across the river. Orley, he peeked out of the cabbage and saw they was headed for a lot of tall buildings, and he knew they was going to a big city. Finally, they docked. And Orley's crate got put on a truck, and the first thing he knew, Orley and the cabbage was in the kitchen of a big, fancy restaurant, and the next thing he knew, they was in a big wooden bowl, and one of the cooks was a-chopping up the cabbage for coleslaw. Orley dodged and ducked the big knife, and he was scared, but in a minute the slaw was all made, and he was safe, even if he was covered with cream and vinegar. He was just congratulating himself when someone scooped him up on a big plate full of slaw and carried him out to a table in the restaurant. He heard a band playing and some voices, so's he kind of pushed the slaw away and peeked out. And he saw a pretty lady and a man a-setting there. Orley was kind of lonesome, so's he stood up on the slaw and he says in his little worm voice,
Howdy, ma'am.
Well, sir, the lady looked down, saw Orley waving 6 or 7 legs at her, and she let out a scream.
Oh, a worm!
She dropped her fork and it hit the plate, and it flipped Orley right up in her hat. He was scared, and he hid in a big seersucker geraniumer, whilst the manager and the waiters and everybody come a-running. Of course, they couldn't find any worm, and the lady felt mighty silly, and to make her feel better, the man took her for a ride through the park in a handsome carriage. The old horse that pulled the carriage reminded Orley of the farm, and so did the green grass, and he stood up on the lady's hat and enjoyed himself. But all of a sudden they went under a low-hanging branch, and it brushed Orley off. He lit on the pavement and started crawling for the grass. Taxicabs came a-whizzing along. More handsome carriages, and Orley crawled and squirmed, and they just missed him. But he finally got on the grass and stopped to catch his breath. Well, sir, just then a little girl and her nurse came along. The little girl saw Orley and picked him up. She says,
I got a worm.
Put that down, Gertrude, says her nurse.
No, I won't. I love him. He's sweet,
says the little girl.
Very well, says the nurse. Keep him.
Ooh,
says the little girl.
Isn't he squishy?
Well, sir, they walked on with the little girl a-squeezing Orley till he could hardly breathe. But all of a sudden her hat blew off. And she dropped Orley. He quick hid under a stone, and when she came back, she couldn't find him. She says,
I want my worm.
Well, Orley, he felt awful sorry, and he almost crawled out to her, but the nurse says,
Never mind, Gertrude. Your father will buy you a pedigreed worm.
And the little girl ran on happy. Orley, he came out from under the stone and heaved a little worm sigh of relief. But just then a big old pigeon saw him. And before Orley could duck, he'd picked him up and flew up in a tree with him. He put Orley down and started to sharpening his beak. Orley started to run, but the tree was a slippery elm, and he skidded off the branch and started to fall. But he only went a little ways because he landed on something soft. It was a big red balloon on a string, and a little boy was a-holding it. But just as Orley lit, the string broke. And the balloon went up in the sky. It went up and up and up, and Orley held on with all his feet. It went clear over the tall buildings, and then the wind caught it, and it sailed over the river and over towns and mountains. And Orley, he was kind of enjoying himself, but all of a sudden a big hawk saw it. He dove right at it. It busted in 1,000 pieces, and Orley started a falling. The things on the ground got bigger and bigger, and then all of a sudden Orley saw something familiar. It was his own house and barn, and in a second he landed right in the haystack, and it didn't hurt a bit.
"Well," says a voice, "I see you're back. Do you still want to be a cabbage worm?"
No, sir, says Orley.
"Very well," says the voice. "Cabbage worm, be an Orley."
And he was mighty happy, and ever after that he always got the best marks in his class in geography, 'cause he traveled so much. But I still think it's easier to get good marks by studying books, don't you? And besides, it's a lot safer to be a bookworm than a cabbage worm. That's all.